it is my pleasure to introduce Robert Levine, a distinguished university professor of English at the University of Maryland, College Park. He is the author and editor of a number of books, including The Lives of Frederick Douglass, and he is the general editor of the Norton Anthology of American Literature, the world's most widely used American literature anthology. He has won a Guggenheim, NEH, and other grants. And most importantly, he is a longtime resident of Ellicott City. And now over to you, Robert. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you. I'm going to use share screen, so let me just get that. And let's see. Okay, so thank you for the kind introduction. My thanks to Rohini Gupta and her group at Howard County Library for setting things up. I've been living in Howard County since 1999, and we all know that one of the great things about our county is our wonderful library system. So it's a real honor to be part of this series. I'm going to talk about my new book, The Failed Promise, which was published last month, and I want to say a few words about the book's title as a way of giving you a sense of its large aims. First and foremost, I'm interested in the failed promise of Reconstruction, the period immediately after the Civil War, when the Republican Congress and Black activists were hopeful that the former Confederate states could be made over into places where ex-Confederate officers weren't in power and Black people had full rights as citizens. In some ways, these goals were achieved, but not without a fight against President Andrew Johnson, and much of the achievement was then undercut by the rise of Jim Crow segregation. The title, The Failed Promise, also speaks to Andrew Johnson himself, who, for reasons I'll be explaining, initially seemed like he'd be a great Reconstruction president. But perhaps the key to the book's full title is the name Frederick Douglass. Typically, histories of Reconstruction focus on white Republican leaders like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, with Douglass and other Black figures getting occasional cameos, but mostly staying in the background. My book puts Douglass at the center of Reconstruction, thereby providing for the first time a Black perspective on the early years of Reconstruction, on Andrew Johnson, and on the impeachment itself. For Frederick Douglass and other Black activists, Reconstruction was about Black voting rights and rights to citizenship, and he and his associates fought for those rights. In the book, I somewhat novelistically try to tell what I call, in this slide, the Douglass-Johnson story, 1865 to 1868. And, whoops, let me go back. So just to highlight this slide, I don't want to read it all, but Douglass and Johnson meet for the first time at Lincoln's second inauguration, March 4th, 1865. Johnson becomes the 17th president, April 15th, 1865. Late September, Douglass begins explicitly speaking out against Johnson. February 7th, 1866, a key moment in the book, Douglass visits Johnson at the White House with the Black delegation. Summer of 1867, Johnson offers Douglass a job in his administration. Around the same time, Douglass is giving his most famous anti-Johnson speech, Sources of Danger to the Republic. They were kind of shadowing each other, as I'll be talking about. And February through March is the impeachment of Johnson, and Douglass's son, Charles, attends the trial, and the Senate falls one vote short of conviction. So this is just an outline of the story I tell, and I won't have time to discuss all aspects of the story. During the Q&A, I hope some of you will ask about the material that I don't cover. My story this evening begins with Lincoln's second inauguration. This is from March 4th, 1865. It's a famous picture of Lincoln giving his "with malice toward none" speech. There's Lincoln there. Historian friends tell me they can see Douglass in the second row. Maybe you have to blow this up 100 times, and I'm not entirely convinced. But Douglass was there. Lincoln invited Douglass to the inauguration because they had become friends of sorts. Douglass met with Lincoln twice during the Civil War to talk about such things as equal pay for Black soldiers. As Lincoln's friend, Douglass was also invited to the post-speech reception in the White House. But when he tried to join the party, he was stopped by security guards who weren't expecting to see a Black man. People who knew Douglass got him admitted, and as soon as Lincoln saw Douglass, he walked over to him, declared to those nearby that Douglass was his friend, and he asked Douglass how he liked his speech, saying that his opinion of the speech would matter to him more than anyone else's. Douglass said he loved the speech, and after Lincoln said how pleased he was that Douglass liked it, Lincoln walked off to another part of the reception to join Andrew Johnson. Douglass tells us what happened next. And this is from Douglass's 1881 Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. I was standing in the crowd when Mr. Lincoln touched Mr. Johnson and pointed me out to him. The first expression which came to his face, and which I think was the true index of his heart, was one of bitter contempt and aversion. The second was the bland and sickly smile of the demagogue. I turned to Mrs. Dorsey, that's Douglass's Black friend, and said, whatever Andrew Johnson may be, he certainly is no friend of our race. Douglass wrote this account 16 years after the event. It's retrospective, and I don't think it's to be fully believed, because at the time, as opposed to 16 years later, Johnson was actually seen as progressive and not particularly racist. In the book, I start with this moment and then somewhat cinematically move back in time to give a more nuanced portrayal of Johnson as not pure evil. Johnson was an up from the bootstraps, self-educated person who worked as a tailor, dabbled in real estate, and then got involved in Tennessee politics, eventually becoming governor, and then in 1857, a senator from Tennessee. As it turned out, he was the only Southern senator who was pro-union and against the secession that followed on Lincoln's election in 1860. Johnson put his life on the line by taking that position. Lincoln appointed Johnson military governor of Tennessee in 1862, and in 1863, Johnson put his life on the line again by calling for the abolition of slavery. Again, this was quite unusual for a Southern politician. He was nominated to be vice president in 1864 when Republicans feared they would lose the election with Hannibal Hamlin of Maine as vice president. They wanted sectional balance and found Johnson to be an appealing figure. He became even more appealing in Republican and abolitionist circles when, in October 1864, while still military governor of Tennessee, Johnson gave a famous speech in which he declared to hundreds, if not thousands, of African Americans at the state capitol of Tennessee that slavery was abolished in Tennessee. Tennessee was a border state, so it wasn't covered by the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation. Johnson's pronouncement had no legal authority, but in some ways he did end slavery de facto in Tennessee by invoking his authority. Here's some snippets from the newspaper account that circulated widely at the time. So you can find this account in a number of newspapers of the period, but it begins by describing how Johnson freed the enslaved people, or declared that he enslaved the enslaved people, in the speech in Nashville, Tennessee, on October 24th. And then what Johnson says to the assembled crowd is, in due time, your leader will come forth, your Moses will be revealed to you. In other words, he's saying that Black people needed their own leaders and they will come forth. According to the reporter on the scene, the large Black crowd responded as follows: "You are our Moses." And the exclamation was caught up and cheered until the Capitol rung again. "We want no Moses but you," again shouted the crowd. And I'm still in the same newspaper article. Johnson's response, "Well then, humble and unworthy as I am, if no other better shall be found, I will indeed be your Moses and lead you through the Red Sea of war and bondage to a fairer future of liberty and peace. It's a remarkable moment. This speech made Johnson's reputation, at least temporarily. Johnson himself became obsessed with the speech, and over the next 6 years, whenever anyone accused him of racism or said he didn't care about Black people, he would remind them that Blacks themselves had declared that he was their Moses. Johnson gave this speech before Douglass set his eyes on him at the White House. I will more briefly tell you what Douglass was up to before Lincoln's second inaugural. He was fighting for Black emancipation and Black rights. It's that simple. He believed that the Civil War should be regarded not as a war to preserve the Union, but as a war of emancipation. And during the war, he formulated his vision of Reconstruction, which I call the Douglass argument. And here is the Douglass argument, as I describe it. Slavery is not abolished until the Black man has the ballot. Douglass said versions of this during the Civil War. And he said these exact words in May 1865, a month after Johnson became president, at a meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was the abolitionist society led by the famous white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who declared that the society should be disbanded because the 13th Amendment was going to end slavery in the United States. He said, we've met our goals, we can disband. So Douglass said slavery is not abolished until the Black man has the ballot. It was a vote at the convention and Douglass won. The society stayed intact because they wanted to work for Black rights. And this is a recurrent theme in Douglass's speeches and writings over the next, well, you could say until he dies in 1895. When Johnson assumed the presidency after the assassination of Lincoln, just a little more than a month after the second inaugural, when Douglass and Johnson first encountered each other from a distance, many Republicans thought they had a president prepared to move forward on Reconstruction. But on May 29, 1865, Johnson issued an amnesty proclamation that essentially welcomed all of the former Confederate states back into the Union on one condition, that they accept the terms of the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery in the country. Otherwise, former Confederate officers could govern the states, and these same ex-Confederate states could decide on their own what to do about the freed people. This shocked some of the Republicans who thought that a man who claimed to be a Moses of the Black people would be willing to entertain a more thoroughgoing Reconstruction. So here's pictures of two of the leading radical Republicans, Charles Sumner, Senator of Massachusetts, Thaddeus Stevens, Congressman of Pennsylvania. And it's probably worth at least saying that the Republican Party during this period does not resemble the Republican Party of our period. Sumner and Stevens both championed Black suffrage and initially believed Johnson shared their views because they met with Johnson and Johnson said he shared their views. I think Johnson, as I argue in the book, was a kind of con artist. Stevens broke from Johnson after the amnesty proclamation in late May of 1865. And during the summer of 1865, Stevens argued that the South had lost the war and should be regarded as occupied territory, with the Northern victors deciding how to reshape or reconstruct the states. Johnson held firm to a bizarre belief that the Southern states had never seceded because secession was not allowed by the Constitution. And a recent historian said that's kind of like saying that murder doesn't happen because it's against the law. It's a strange view. Thus, Johnson championed what historians now call presidential restoration as opposed to congressional reconstruction. Conflict between the president and the Republican Congress flared by December of 1865. Douglass and other African Americans turned against Johnson more quickly. In a lecture in Boston in the fall of 1865, Douglass warned, quote, that the gains of the Civil War were on the verge of being lost because of the imbecility or treachery of President Johnson, end quote. Douglass and other Black activists were also concerned that the Republicans weren't pushing hard enough for Black citizenship and that something needed to be done. That takes us to Douglass's second encounter with Johnson on February 7, 1866. At a Black convention in December 1865, Douglass proposed that a Black delegation should go to Washington to lobby for the full rights of citizenship for African Americans. The convention approved the resolution, and the group, which included Douglass, arrived in Washington, D.C. late January of 1866. They were greeted by Charles Sumner, who helped set up a meeting between the Black delegation and Johnson, which is the subject of a full chapter of my book. Johnson was willing to meet with the delegation because he thought it would be good publicity for him. During 1865, he had regularly met with Black groups, generally talking to them rather than with them, and telling them that he was their Moses. Confident that this meeting would go well, he brought along a stenographer named James Clephane, who had pioneered a new form of shorthand. Clephane took notes of a meeting that probably lasted 90 minutes, and a transcript of the meeting appeared in a Washington newspaper that very evening. It then went viral, as we say, appearing in newspapers across the country. The meeting did not go as well as Johnson had hoped. In fact, it embarrassed him. These are two of the, I think, about 10 people who showed up as part of the Black delegation, George T. Downing and Lewis Henry Douglass. The nominal leader of the group was George T. Downing, a Black activist and caterer, and a friend of Charles Sumner, who had got him the job of running the congressional cafeteria. The secretary of the group was Lewis Henry Douglass, the Douglass's oldest son. As I emphasized throughout the book, Douglass again and again worked with other Black activists. The book is not just about Douglass, though my focus today is mostly on Douglass. Here's what happened at the meeting. There were initial greetings with Downing leading the way and saying that they were there to talk to Johnson about Black suffrage. Johnson cut off any hope for an actual conversation by then launching into a speech, which Douglass later said went on for hours. He was exaggerating. Eventually, some of the group interrupted Johnson with questions, which made Johnson defensive, so he brought up his status as a Moses for Black people. And this is from the newspaper transcript of the meeting. And what Johnson said, according to the transcript, is, "I have said, and I will repeat here, that if the colored man in the United States could find no other Moses or any other Moses that would be more able and efficient than myself, I would be his Moses to lead them from bondage to freedom." That comment seemed to end the discussion. There was an exchange of thank yous. And according to the transcript, the Black group is heading to the door. But just as the Black delegation was leaving, Douglass turned to the president and said, and that's on the slide, "If the president will allow me, I would like to say one or two words. You enfranchise your enemies and disenfranchise your friends." In other words, Johnson was helping the ex-Confederates that were once his enemy, he had called them treasonous, while scorning the Blacks, his friends who had fought in the Union Army. This accusation infuriated Johnson, and the meeting became a back and forth between Douglass and Johnson, all captured by the stenographer, in which Douglass goaded Johnson, getting him angrier and angrier so that Johnson would expose the full extent of his racism and resistance to a Reconstruction that would empower African Americans. Eventually, Johnson declared that Blacks should consider emigration. And this, again, is all part of the transcript. When Black activists read the transcript of the meeting, which was reprinted in such Black newspapers as the Christian Recorder, along with a number of Washington, D.C. newspapers, they were outraged. This was Black's Moses. The meeting had got away from Johnson. He expressed his frustration to his aides shortly after the delegation departed And one of those aides shared Johnson's private comments with a newspaper editor who refused to print them because he liked Johnson. But the letter survives in manuscript. As reported in that letter, Johnson declared to his aides, quote, "Those damned sons of bitches thought they had me in a trap. I know that damn Douglas. He's just the same as any," and then he uses the N-word, "and he would soon cut a white man's throat than not," end quote. Meanwhile, the Black delegation quickly crafted a response to what Johnson had to say to them at the meeting. The response appeared in the next day's Washington, D.C. newspaper as a frame to a corrected transcript of the meeting. Douglass and this group clearly had media savvy. In his 1881 autobiography, Douglass wrote that the meeting was a turning point for the way it exposed Johnson and further undercut his support. And I was able to do digital searches in newspaper around the country, and this transcript is everywhere, including in California. That spring and summer saw massacres of over 100 Blacks in Memphis and New Orleans, violence that Douglass and others believed was encouraged by Johnson's racism and his refusal to support Black suffrage. The Moses of Black people had become a Pharaoh, Douglass said. I'm now going to move quickly through things I talk about in the book to get to the impeachment. Douglass continued to speak out against Johnson, and Johnson was following these speeches with the help of friends. Douglass developed a fabulous anti-Johnson stump speech, Sources of Danger to the Republic, which he gave to numerous audiences during 1867. The key source of danger, Douglass said, was that the Constitution failed to offer proper checks on the presidency, which he insisted was especially dangerous when a bad man, that's the term he uses, when a bad man became president, kind of prescient. In an effort to co-opt Douglass or simply to shut him down as a critic, Johnson, during the summer of 1867, attempted to recruit Douglass with a job in his administration. He did this through back doors secretly because he didn't want to be publicly embarrassed if Douglass decided to turn him down. However, Douglass thwarted Johnson by declining the job in a letter published in a New York newspaper. We now come to the controversy that precipitated the February 1868 impeachment of Johnson. By late 1867, Johnson wanted to fire Edwin Stanton, who was the Secretary of War under Lincoln and then under Johnson. Johnson thought Stanton was overly sympathetic to the radical Republicans, but such a firing at the time would have been an illegal and even an impeachable offense under the Tenure of Office Act passed by the Republican Congress in March 1867. And here's a few passages from the Tenure of Office Act. And just to summarize, the gist of Section 1 is that anyone who's been appointed by and with the advice and consent of the Senate has to remain in that position unless the Senate itself concurs in the removal of that person. And Section 6 stipulates that violations of the Tenure of Office Act would be regarded as high misdemeanors and thus as an impeachable offense. And it's worth saying that about 2 decades later, the Supreme Court ruled that the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional, but it's on the books starting March 1867, and it's really crucial to the February 1868 impeachment. Why did the Republicans pass such an act? Perhaps they hoped it would help them get rid of a president they hated, but without having to address issues of racism and without seeming overly sympathetic to Black people. From what Douglass and other Black activists regularly saw during the 1865 to 1868 period, when every Black suffrage bill was voted down by whites north of the Mason-Dixon line, and this includes in Connecticut and Minnesota, and a couple of other states, they saw that Johnson was not the sole racist in the country. There were plenty of racists in the North and in the Republican Party. So using the Tenure of Office Act, if possible, was arguably a pragmatic way of getting rid of Johnson without exposing the Republicans to the charge that they were a Black party, something they feared would lose them votes. In February 1868, Johnson asked Ulysses S. Grant, general of the US Army, to fire Stanton. When Grant refused because of the Tenure of Office Act, Johnson went ahead and did the deed himself. And here's a nice picture of Edwin M. Stanton. I like the beard. The Republicans' response at this firing, they're overjoyed. And they quickly formulated 11 articles of impeachment, all of which focused on the Tenure of Office Act. Stanton's response, he refused to accept the firing because he saw it as illegal, and he hid in his office for several months, locked behind the door, being fed, I think, by George T. Downing, the caterer, to see what would happen with the trial. The response of Douglass and other Black activists, they had no interest in the Tenure of Office Act. They wanted Johnson impeached and convicted for his racist resistance to Reconstruction, which they believed had contributed to hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths of African Americans. They thought Johnson was a murderer, and they thought that the trial itself should have been about something other than what one African American newspaper termed, and I'm quoting, legal quibbles. It's worth emphasizing that there were no Black voices as part of the trial. There were moments, but not many, when the House managers of the impeachment talked about Johnson as a failed Reconstruction president and as someone who had done terrible harm to the freed people. But the trial was mainly about what Johnson had done to a white man named Edwin Stanton. Virtually all newspaper reports spoke to the tedium of the debates on whether the Tenure of Office Act had been violated. And here is a famous picture of the Senate as a court of impeachment. In some way, it was like going to the theater, but I think if you enlarge this by 100 times, you'd see that all the people way up there in the gallery are looking bored. That's what the newspaper accounts tended to say. Douglass wanted, and you could actually find the transcript online. It's kind of amazing, all the legal arguments about the Tenure of Office Act. Douglass wanted Johnson convicted and removed from office, but he stayed on the sidelines during the trial, even deciding against attending the trial when he was offered a ticket. There were at least 3 reasons for this. First, he was frustrated that the trial wasn't more directly about the big issues central to Reconstruction. Second, he didn't want his status as a celebrity Black man to distract from the proceedings. Third, he had his son, Charles Ramon Douglass, in Washington, D.C., and on occasion at the trial itself as a conduit to what was going on. Here's a picture of Charles Ramon Douglass. Charles was Anna and Douglass's 3rd son, and he had a job at the Freedmen's Bureau in Washington, D.C. Charles reported to his father on what was happening with the impeachment proceedings, and his position was clear. He had absolutely no interest in the Tenure of Office Act, and he wanted Johnson convicted as a failed Reconstruction president. I'm sure many of you know what happened with the impeachment trial. There were votes on 2 of the 11 articles of impeachment in May 1868. Both fell short by 1 vote, and a decision was made to end the trial. Douglass, his son, and many other Blacks felt betrayed. Charles and his father both believed that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Salmon Chase, who presided over the trial, was at fault for keeping the proceedings focused on the Tenure of Office Act. Chase was a former abolitionist who was angling for the presidential nomination from the pro-South, anti-Reconstruction Democratic Party, knowing that Ulysses S. Grant would get the Republican nomination. Douglass was furious that Chase, a former friend and abolitionist, would let his presidential ambitions override what had once been his moral convictions. In an angry editorial, he declared that such ambition had led Chase to the gutter. And that's Douglass's word, gutter. And just an aside, I'll say that there's a cache of letters at the Library of Congress from Charles Ramon Douglas to his father that I don't think have ever been really examined closely. And they became an important resource to me for thinking about how Charles and his father were responding to the impeachment. I want to conclude by looking at Douglas's comments on the trial in 1880, 5 years after Johnson's death, and 12 years after the verdict that allowed Johnson to stay in office another 10 months. So this is Douglas and Johnson in a speech of 1880. Andrew Johnson, the Moses of the colored race, and here he's being ironic, had betrayed that race into the blood-stained hands of the old master class. He had betrayed the Republican Party by which he had been elected when he was plotting the organization of a new party upon its ruins, when he was seeking the destruction of the Freedmen's Bureau, when outrage, riot, and murder held sway in the South. This passage speaks to one of the large arguments of my book. This is Douglas's and other Black activists' perspective on Johnson, and virtually none of this got into the trial. I would posit that Republicans' failure to make the case against Johnson in Douglas's terms, whether at the trial or in the articles of impeachment themselves, may well have contributed to the failure of Reconstruction because it allowed Americans to avoid confronting the racial issues at the center of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the nation's longer history. And Reconstruction did fail. By the late 1870s, the voting rights for African Americans that had been won by the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870 had effectively been nullified by segregationist regulations and practices, including anti-Black violence. It became extremely difficult, if not impossible, for Blacks to vote in the Jim Crow South until the 1960s. If Douglas were alive today, I think he'd have much to say about what's going on with Georgia, Texas, and elsewhere with the new restrictions on voting rights, which he would no doubt view as taking us back to the days of Jim Crow. But he would also remind us of American ideals and possibilities. In one of Douglas's most famous late career speeches, he addressed the scourge of Black lynching in the country. Everything he had fought for during the Johnson administration seemed to be in jeopardy. And so this is one of his most famous speeches that appeared in pamphlet form. I like this picture of the older Douglas. Douglas, even during this time of lynching, never gave up hope. And this is one of the many reasons I love working on Douglas. Consider the way he concludes a speech that is mainly about violence done to the Black body. And these words will also basically conclude my talk. So these are the closing words of the lessons of the hour. Put away your race prejudice, banish the idea that one class must rule over another, recognize the fact that the rights of the humblest citizen are as worthy of protection as those of the highest, and your problems will be solved, and whatever may be in store for it in the future, whether prosperity or adversity, whether it shall have foes without or foes within, whether there shall be peace or war, based upon the eternal principles of truth, justice, and humanity, and with no class having any cause of complaint or grievance, your republic will stand and flourish forever. Douglas may have lamented the failed promise of Reconstruction, but in the Declaration of Independence and other founding documents, he continued to see promise in America for the achievement someday of an interracial democracy. His words and deeds continue to inspire. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for that great presentation. You mentioned this at the end, but the first question we did have, and was something that I was thinking as you were speaking as well, was how do you think Douglas would react to the voting laws, recently passed in Georgia, Texas, and other states? I don't know if you want to take that opportunity, if there's anything else you want to say on that, if you want to move to another question.
No, I mean, I could further elaborate that it's almost like a broken record in the book that he is talking about voting rights. And I have an epilogue that runs from 1870 to 1895, where he's seeing voting rights being taken away from Black people. So yeah, in the early response to the book, early reviewers have been saying, this does seem to speak to the current moment. I think it speaks to the current moment. If you're interested, I published an op-ed in the Washington Post and in the Baltimore Sun, two different op-eds that offers a little bit more specifics about this. But sure, I mean, any effort to constrict the vote, and in Georgia, you can see how there are certain things that were being done that specifically seemed to kind of focus on African-American voters. Yeah, I think he would strongly object. And therefore, I think that my book gives a really powerful prehistory of some of the issues that we're still dealing with today. So again, the failed promise, if you take that title and not the subtitle, I think we're still talking about right now.
Yeah, definitely.
Hi, Robert. This is
Hi.
Rita Sherman.
Hi.
I loved your presentation.
Thank you.
I have a question from Steve W. What lessons can we learn today from this history to make sure it is not repeated?
I mean, I would say the same kind of thing. And it's a very difficult history because there's all this excitement about Reconstruction and the possibility of social change. It doesn't happen. And why doesn't it happen? And Isabel Wilkerson spoke at Howard County Library about caste and link caste to race. And I kind of jump on board with that. The one could link caste, race, and history. And what Douglass starts talking about in the 1870s and 1880s, he says, and this is kind of creepy, he says, such is the history of slavery in the United States and the dire racial relations, linked to slavery, it might take 100 years for the social change that he's imagining. So I'll just say, like a good historian, that it's important to know what was going on in the past, what the ideals were of the past, what got in the way of those ideals, and see if that's useful. And I have to tell you, I published an op-ed in the Washington Post about why things were bad in Georgia and Texas. And you know what? The Republicans ignored me. So, what can we do? It's hard. Clearly, if one cares about these sorts of issues, it's going to be more grassroots kinds of things. But I do think being informed about American history, which is something that the new regulations in Texas are saying, we don't want you to be informed about history, kind of keeping you from that.
Thanks.
So we had a question from Judy. Again, on the same topic. I don't know if you want to elaborate on anything of any specific similarities you see between the time period you write about and the past events regarding civil rights between now and 2016.
I think they're totally parallel. I have to say that when I began writing the book, it was when Trump was president, and I was thinking about impeachment, issues surrounding impeachment. I've been talking about different kinds of racial issues, and to kind of switch gears a little bit, there's a chapter in my book on Douglass's speech, Sources of Danger to the Republic. And the argument there is something wrong with the American Constitution that has to be revised because presidents have too much power. And he says, for example, presidents have the power to pardon. Think about that. We have to get rid of the pardoning power. Presidents have the power of patronage jobs in which people sell their souls to work for a president. It's a very haunting speech. What I decided to do, because I didn't want the book to be a 2018 or Trump book, is I do not use Trump's name in the book at all. But I address issues of authoritarianism and racism. And in both instances, I think they speak to current conflicts, right now, and help us to better understand them. And then people who are really good at actually making things happen are going to have to figure out how to make things happen. But I read today in the New York Times, someone said that if you don't like the kinds of things the Republicans are doing, and I'm not sure that everyone assembled today, all 60 some odd people, don't like what the Republicans are doing. This person said the Democrats have to learn to go for the jugular. They're too nice. But the speech I look at, Sources of Danger to the Republic, is included in the appendix because I discovered a version that Douglass gave to a Black group. And so there's a version in the Yale Frederick Douglass papers that Douglass gave to a white group in St. Louis. This speech is very different, in which he's talking about Black community, Black anger, refers to Andrew Johnson as Massa Johnson, which he doesn't do in any other versions of the speech. So it was an interesting discovery. He spoke to in a Black lecture series in Philadelphia, and there is a transcript in a newspaper that was published in Philadelphia, and I supply that as an appendix to get a different view of Douglass, because we think of him often as talking to integrated, mixed, or mostly white groups. Here he's speaking to a Black group.
Yeah, it sounds like you found, that documentation of code switching depending on the audience he was speaking with. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's another question from Steve W. How could the House have used other terms of impeachment? Were there laws violated that they could have cited?
Well, that's a good question. And I think I probably was being, quixotic, naive, utopianist, whatever, in saying that it would have been nice if the articles of impeachment had more to say about Johnson as a bad Reconstruction president. Was he violating laws by doing that? That's not clear. So what's interesting about the Articles of Confederation is they kind of squeeze in little things here and there that they say are violations, such as he went on a lecture tour in which he was called, this was in late 1866, in which he was calling for the death, the execution of leading Republicans, leading so-called radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens, Benjamin Wade, and Charles Sumner. That is in the articles. That's kind of buried, articles of impeachment that's kind of buried in there. Mm-hmm. I have in the book a speech that Benjamin Butler gave. He was a congressman from Massachusetts who was one of the House managers of the impeachment, in which he actually lays out the argument that Johnson was a murderer for resisting Reconstruction moves. So if you buy that argument, maybe something like that could have got in there. And if that got in there in any sort of way at all, then you wouldn't have happened what ended up happening. And that is, after Butler gave that speech, Chief Justice Salmon Chase said, "You're out of order," because that's not what the impeachment is about. The impeachment is about the Tenure of Office Act. So given the historical period, I think it would have been hard to make the case that the impeachment was about racism. It's really interesting looking at African-American newspapers, which tend not to be looked at in standard studies of the impeachment, to see that's the case that was being made against Johnson. I don't know enough about the law to answer this question, with total authority, but it's a very good question, because I do wish that somehow more got into those articles about Black people so that it would actually make sense to have someone like Douglass testify, so it wouldn't seem that the whole thing is about the harm done to a white man. So it's a good question, and it was a difficult issue for the Republicans who were creating the Articles of Impeachment, and so they leaned on the Tenure of Office Act.
All right, I have a question. I believe this is from Jeffrey. Why didn't the majority of Black leaders who were more trusting of Johnson in 1865 follow Douglass's lead in seeing through Johnson's hypocrisy?
Okay, another very good question. What I trace in the book is the way that many Black people like Johnson, definitely in 1864. And one of my key sources that absolutely has never been used in studies of impeachment is the Christian Recorder, the Christian Recorder was the most widely read African-American newspaper, cultural organ brought up by the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And it's very easily searchable. And there's also copies everywhere that one can look at. And basically, in 1864, they love the Moses speech. They love that this is an abolitionist Southerner. You know, they can't believe it. When Johnson becomes president, I found a diary entry from a white Republican saying that a bunch of Republicans got together and said, he's going to be better than Abraham Lincoln. You know, Lincoln was going slow on something. He's going to be better because look at the Moses speech that he gave in Tennessee. Johnson also met with Black groups repeatedly, and I have a whole chapter in that in the book, all these meetings. He does tend to talk to them, but he does say that he has some idea that maybe he will get behind the idea of Black suffrage. And even in his first speech to Congress in December of 1865, which has a lot of racist comments in it, he says, I could consider limited Black suffrage, which is exactly where Lincoln was at the time that he was assassinated. Douglass was alienated first before other Black leaders. There was someone named John Langston, who eventually became a law professor at Howard University, who actually liked Johnson through 1865 and perhaps beyond. It's not until after the meeting with Johnson and that transcript that you could read everywhere, that you find in the Christian Examiner that the Christian Recorder, that they're giving up. And so that is a key, I think, that the meeting with Johnson, the transcript of the meeting, that hold other people to Douglass's position. And Douglass could be an absolutist. And as some of you may know, Douglass, who met with Lincoln at the White House twice and said that Lincoln was kind of like a friend, also compared Lincoln to Jefferson Davis because he thought he wasn't doing enough to win the Civil War. And in 1864, wrote to friends in England, says, I can't vote for Lincoln. He's a bad president. He does change his mind and supports Lincoln, but he stays kind of hidden. So even someone like Lincoln that he seems to be friendly with is falling short in Douglass's eyes. So I would say Johnson, in a crafty kind of way, was presenting himself as a man who cared about Black people. And it worked through 1865 for most Blacks who were watching, except Douglass started getting frustrated pretty early in the way that he also could get frustrated with someone like Abraham Lincoln. And when you look at the Christian Recorder, it's February 1866. That's a turning point.
Oh, okay. So now Roberto Gomez asked the question, how would Douglass address the modern sentiment that the Democratic Party is the quote unquote Black Party?
I mean, that's an interesting question. And our period is so different from that period, but I think there are still some of the same issues. So I thought I read somewhere, and maybe someone could correct me, but I think this is right, that if only white people voted in the last election, Trump would have won. You know, he would have won Georgia, he would have won Pennsylvania, he would have won Michigan. And you could argue that what Trump managed to do is precisely what the questioners suggest, make the Democrats seem like the Black Party, which kind of brings out a racist response still, 150 and more years later. I'll just talk about Douglass at his own time, and that is that once he decided that he was going to support Lincoln, he decided not to campaign for him, mainly because he didn't want Lincoln to be perceived as too close to Black people. He thought that that would hurt him. And he had begun to think that that it would be great if Lincoln won because his opponent was really racist. And part of my argument in the book for why Douglass decides not to attend the impeachment trial, even though his son got him a ticket and booked him a hotel room, interestingly enough. And then the son writes him, "Where were you? Why didn't you come?" I think that he thought that being there would create that identification, that those who want to impeach Johnson were people who were overly close to Black people, and in a racist society that wouldn't work, which again, to get back to the 10-year of office act, maybe that was the pragmatic way to go. So I don't know how Douglass would respond right now, but I would say that this is still an issue. And it seems to me that the Republican Party sometimes uses this as a way of gaining support.
So we have a question from Jan that Rohini noted that she wanted us to ask. Do we need a Black Moses today? If so, do you think that there is anyone that is filling that role?
Right. I mean, that's a really good question. I would say, sure, why not? Wouldn't it be great right now if there was a charismatic Black leader like Martin Luther King, for example? To go back to the Johnson Black Moses thing, I think ironically that Douglass was the Black Moses. In fact, his second autobiography is titled My Bondage and My Freedom, and it evokes the book of Exodus. He is Moses. And then there are some Black leaders who didn't like him. Like, who is he? Why should he be the only Black leader? So I actually wrote a book back in the 1990s on Douglass and Martin Delany about the whole issue of Black leadership and whether there should be one person, more people, a man, a woman, et cetera, et cetera. What I would say to that question is we could use a lot of great leaders. We could use a lot of great leaders. It would be great Black women, Black men, Latino, other people of color. Great leaders, white. I mean, I think we need great leaders, and but not in that kind of authoritarian fashion, but people who can mobilize people. And the fun thing about writing about Douglass is, and I'm picking up in David Blight's biography when he talks about Douglass as a prophet. Douglass in some ways remains a leader. His words resonate. He seems to anticipate issues that we're dealing with, right now.
We have another interesting question from Steve W. In Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, she posits that we remain an essentially racist society. Do you think Douglass, were he living today, would agree, or would he point to examples that counter Wilkerson's claims?
Again, I'm very reluctant to say, what Douglass would think. But I can say that in the 1880s and 1890s, he's saying, I've learned something about America. It has this entrenched racism, and it's going to take a while for things to change. And I imagine that he would see the entrenched racism here today. I mean, it would be, I think, evident to him in lots of different ways, including just looking at basic things like per capita income, property issues, what schools are like in Black cities as opposed to white majority suburbs, and the kind of rhetoric that we see being used at times that fans racist flames. So I think that the Isabel Wilkerson book it's really fascinating and gets you thinking in fresh ways about race and hierarchy. And one of the things that I like about the book is it says virtually nothing about the Reconstruction period. So I was able to kind of jump into that. And I recently wrote an essay on the Reconstruction novelist Albion Tourget, who was a big admirer of Frederick Douglass, and how he in a novel that sold 600,000 copies in 1879, anticipated Isabel Wilkerson's arguments, because he says that America is like a caste system that he compares to India, and that's in his novel of 1879. And I'm giving a short talk tomorrow about that. If anyone goes on my author's website, they can get the link and hear me talk for 5 minutes or so about that particular issue.
All right, I think that was supposed to be our last question, but really quick, I want to throw out short answer. What happened to Stanton? Carol wants to know what happened to Stanton.
Stanton, I'm tempted to go back. Stanton stays in his office for something like 3 to 4 months. And I found evidence that George T. Downing, the Black haterer, was bringing him food. When Johnson was acquitted, he left his office and resigned. And someone else took the job that was acceptable to the radical Republicans. And then he died same year. So I think it really took a toll on him. And yeah, the whole story of him hiding out like that is really fascinating, really fascinating. One thing I want to add that I hope it isn't too self-aggrandizing, but we have a partner that has my book, and I just want to add that Barnes & Noble has 5 copies, the 2 Barnes & Noble in Howard County, and I signed them. So they were really nice to let me sign them, and they're on display. So I want to support them too.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating talk. And I think there's a request for a link to your chat. And I can send it out in a follow-up email, or unless if you have it right now, you can post it in the chat.
You can also put it in right now. The
So you mean my
UMD
my
blog?
website?
Yeah, what's the best place for people to look you up?
Yeah, it's let me just, I have it right here. Hold on for a second. Okay, so it's right here. If you can see that, go umd.edu, Robert S. Levine. And if you type into Google my name and the title of the book, you get this hit, and you get lots of other hits as well.
That is great. Thank you. That was a really interesting talk, and especially, you know, nowadays it's we've all heard that you know, quote about history repeating itself, and then to actually live and see it happening.
Right.
It's
right,
pretty
right.
fascinating.
Yeah.
To see how things change, and they have changed, and how things don't change. So in so many different ways. So that was a very fascinating discussion.
As I say, I thought I was writing about impeachment when I wrote the book. It turned out I was writing about voting rights. I didn't realize that till after the book was published.
Yeah, and that's also interesting about how impeachments work. So, you know, it's really interesting because I'm sure somebody's going to be writing that book, and it might be a lot similar to what you wrote about events that happened, you know, way back. I mean, almost more than 100 years back. So
yeah, absolutely.
And before I wrap up, we will be sending out a follow-up email tomorrow morning, which will have links to a few of our upcoming events. It will have a survey, and we would love to hear back from you about that. We do have, if you love reading books, we have our book club review coming up on October 5th. And it's a great way to learn about all of the new books. It's a very interesting presentation by the team at Central. So please do join in if you can. And thank you once again. Thanks, Ash. Thanks, Rita. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Have a great night.
Thank you again, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.